Okay, hi everybody. So today's going to be pretty simple. I mostly just want to um, basically do an overview of the Firebird, that short story fairy tale I had you guys look at, or as the Russians would put it, a wonder tale. And this was one of the ones that Prop looked at in his own studies. And I think you'll see that it has a lot of good um, examples of the functions that he's talking about. So you can see how those ideas are connected there. So yeah, what I had you guys do was discuss it in the discussion questions. And so what I wanted to do is kind of respond to what you guys said, use what you did to address some points. Y'all did well, y'all had some great insights. And there's obviously a lot of different interpretations that you can take this in, a lot of different directions you can go with for this tale. But I'll kind of talk about some of the choices different people made and talk about what I would do for this story. So basically, I'm just going to go through the Firebird from beginning to end and analyze which functions appear and what order they go in and what is what. So pretty similar to what we did with the Wizard of Oz, but kind of responding to what you guys are saying. So without further ado, let's get to it. All right, so I've got a Word document open here. And in the other tab, I've got the Firebird, so I can look back at it. Okay, so originally what I would have had you guys do was write it on the side of the handout there, but given that we're not doing things in person, the discussion question seemed like a good way to go about that, good opportunity to look into it. Okay, so I didn't require you guys to list all the steps here, but you may find it helpful to go through the steps anyway, even if you don't write them down. So I'm going to basically do the same thing. I'm going to go through the whole process here. So first step, read the story. Done. Got that taken care of. I've probably read this story quite a few times by this point. Okay, step two, the cast of characters, or the dramatis personae. So the dramatis personae of this story, who are our characters? You guys identified a lot of good options there. Of course, for the hero, who do we have as our hero? We have Prince Ivan. He has the two brothers, but they're not named. He's the only one of them that's named. Ivan is a pretty common name in Russia, so it's a lot like naming him Jack or John. But he does all the protagonist things. He sets out to solve a problem. So if you're ever wondering who the hero is, a good way to think about it is the hero in one of these stories is the one who sets out to solve a problem. And then the villain is usually someone who causes a problem or tries to harm the hero. Now, I think it's very interesting. We could take this in different directions here. I saw some people saying the villain was the brothers, which makes sense, right? They are trying to harm him, and they actually succeed. They kill him at the end, and he gets brought back to life. So the brothers could be very good as villains. But if they aren't the type of villain that causes him a harm at the beginning, because it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be them harming him at the start. That seems to be something that happens later on. But an alternative way of looking at this that I saw a couple of people go for, which I thought was very interesting, was the Firebird itself. And now, why would the Firebird be the villain? It's kind of weird. It's kind of a plot device, but the villain harms the hero at the start or causes the problem that the hero has to solve. And the Firebird actually does this in a way. The Firebird is the one who's stealing the cherries and basically sets Ivan off on his journey to go get the Firebird. So I think there's an argument to be made there. In a way, the brothers and the Firebird kind of split the functions of the sphere of action. I forget if I've mentioned that term, but the sphere of action is all the functions associated with a particular character. So, Ivan is a hero, so he does hero functions, does hero things. The villains would be the ones who do villain things, like trying to harm the hero or causing the problem that the hero needs to solve. But in here, those two things have been split up. So the function of villain is kind of being shared by the brothers in the Firebird, if you want to think about it that way. Or maybe you decide that the Firebird isn't a character per se, so it doesn't really count as the villain. In that case, you just probably go with the brothers. But it's worth noting uh, that you can take this either way, which is kind of interesting. I think for dispatcher, we have a pretty good example of a dispatcher, which is Tsar Barandy, Ivan's father, is the one who sends him off on his quest to, says, you must go do this. So he makes a very good dispatcher there. And there's an argument to be made for some other dispatchers later on if you want to think about it in a certain way. For princess, we have a classic example, which is Princess Helen. A lot less character than Princess Fiona in Shrek. Princess Helen doesn't even get any speaking parts. She's just dragged along whether she wants to be involved in all this or not, but that's how it goes. Let's see. For false hero, now this might be a little tricky because it's not as we have with like Lord Farquaad, pretending he's a great valiant knight, but the false hero, right, is the one who's defined by they claim to be able to do something important, solve the problem, or another way help people out, but actually fail at it, and are basically lying or just misjudging their own abilities. And they may sometimes pretend to be the hero. And the brothers fit that category. They do all of those things. At the start, they're just kind of failing to live up to what Ivan can do, but later on, they actually do attack Ivan and try and steal his identity, steal his victory. So I think they fit very well as the false hero here. Now, of course, we got to mention our helpers and our donors. Honestly, the book and sort of interpretation of what's a helper and what's a donor is kind of hard to decide sometimes, because the book will say things like, this character is a donor because they give the gift of their companionship, which would seem like kind of a helper thing to do. But I think one way that you can see something pointing more towards a donor than a helper is whether they go through the donor sequence, DEF, of testing the hero in some way. And if they do, then they kind of fit that model of a donor. Whereas a helper more often, maybe not always, but a lot of the time would just kind of appear randomly, would not test the hero. That's my take on it anyway. As you can see, there's a lot of room for interpretation. But if we were to look at this kind of character, who do we have as this kind of character? We have the wolf. And this is fun. Usually wolves are villains. Here we have the wolf as the hero of this, as the helper or donor in this story. And I'm going to lean towards donor because we do go through a testing sequence there. Okay, so now let's identify the harm or the lack. And honestly, we could interpret it either way. If we want to say the Firebird is a villain, then it's a harm. So it would be capital A. What harm has the Firebird done? The Firebird has stolen the cherries from King Bear or Tsar Barandy's garden. And that causes some problems that Ivan needs to solve. And you'll notice it doesn't affect him super directly. It's kind of indirect, but that's okay too, so long as there's a problem in need of solving. Or you could put it as a lowercase a, in which case Microsoft Word will try and autocorrect it for you. But the lack could be just, there's a Firebird that's stealing cherries, and the Firebird is not being vilified here. Okay, so we've got our harm and or our lack. I could even see an argument for trying to interpret it both ways at the same time. So what next? Next we have the preparatory part, which is usually tied up in the beginning of the story. So it's a very good place to start thinking about all these things. So I'm not going to go with the Greek letters just to save time, even though I do love Greek letters. But let's go with just typing them out, and that way we'll all be on the same page, literally on the same page, looking at the same stuff here. So alpha is not technically a function. It's the initial situation at the start of the story. So this is one that I find is kind of tricky sometimes. Pardon me if I sneeze. Um, there, sneeze is distracting me. Uh, People have a tendency to want to choose a lot of different things for the initial situation, but when we're talking about the initial situation, we're usually looking at like just the first sentence. Um, there we go. What happens in the story before anything changes? Like the stories usually have, something changed. So what was it like before it changed? For A Wizard of Oz, we had Dorothy lived with her aunt and uncle. Um, Here we have the initial situation, and that equals there was Tsar Barandy had 3 sons and a garden. That's kind of all we need there, I think. Okay. Next, we go to beta. We're looking for examples of absentation, which is Prop's fancy word for somebody's absent, somebody is missing, or isolated in some way. And notice that this can happen kind of out of order. Um, I think the absentation is just going to be Ivan leaves home over the course of this. Now, this is tied up in the counteraction, but I think that's okay. There's a lot of stories that go like, once upon a time, a young man named Jack decided to leave home to seek his fortune, to go off on an adventure or something like that. And in that case, the absentation would be part of the leaving as well. Let's see, what else we got? I believe we have an interdiction. Yes. So this is gamma is for interdiction, which is, of course, you might recall a commandment, that people aren't supposed to violate. Now, this is another tricky one. It might, I saw a lot of people saying the Firebird violates the commandment, don't eat the cherries. And I could kind of see that, but I think there's actually an even stronger one here, which is directed at the sort of main characters here, or like the protagonist and his immediate relations, right? The commandment is don't fall asleep. So the brothers and Ivan are each instructed to not fall asleep. They're supposed to stay up, stay awake, and then keep an eye out to see who has been stealing the cherries. But the first 2 brothers fail at that. So you could, if you want to see this as an example of the hero making false claims and failing, the false hero making false claims and failing. But I'm more inclined, because we're still in the preparatory part, to call it delta, which, what is the word for that? Violation of the interdiction. The brothers fall asleep. So that's the commandment, and its failure is very often in the preparatory part. But I think you can actually have it in other stories, in other parts of the story. That's what's weird about Prop, to me, isolating some of these ideas off and saying, oh, they're part of the preparatory part, because I think there's a lot of situations where you need to have like a commandment later on in the story, and that is, of course, going to be violated, because they always are. So I think you could actually have some gamma and delta going on later on, but we will like hold off on that for now. Okay. Reconnaissance. That's epsilon. This is another one that's tempting for us, because it does seem like, what is Ivan doing here? He's doing reconnaissance, but this kind of reconnaissance specifically refers to the villain spying on the hero. I don't think we have that here. I don't think the brothers do any spying, do they? If you want to interpret them as the villains. Doesn't seem like it. So I'm going to say that there's no reconnaissance in this story, which means that equally there's no designation, which is zeta, which is where you find out the the information where the villain finds out the information they were looking for. Trickery, kind of loose here. Don't really see the villains or the brothers or the Firebird doing trickery at this point in the story, so I think we can skip that as well, which means we skip theta, which is complicity, which is when somebody is tricked by the villain. So maybe we could also make an argument with these ones as well, that there is that they could appear later on in the story. We'll think about that when we get there. Okay, we've already gotten our harm and our lack. So now we're into the main story. And basically we have all this leading to the harm or the lack that Ivan has to deal with. Then we have mediation. Which is, just the connective material, the connecting incident, Prop calls it sometimes. The stuff that goes in between the hero having a problem and taking counteraction about that problem. And I'm a little skeptical here on in an absolute sense. Like, Prop, is this really a function, or is this just like connecting point A to point B? Which happens a lot in these stories. There's a lot of connective tissue. But Prop says it's a function, so I guess we'll go with that. The connective incident. Let's see. I guess based on the handout, the hero is sort of starting to make a plan, but hasn't yet put the plan into motion. Okay, do we see an example of this here? Let's see. I think maybe it's catching the Firebird by the tail, telling his father. Those are the kind of things that lead us from the problem to taking action. The feather in particular seems to be, taking a feather from the tail seems very useful because it allows him to show his father evidence of who the thief is. So that does seem to be kind of like the sort of thing that Prop is talking about here. Okay, C is our counter action. Ivan will go find the Firebird. That's pretty straightforward, right? You've also got the other brothers doing it too. So let's see. Could try to insert an up arrow symbol, but I'm okay with just making a little caret bracket here. We'll know what that means. So this is our up arrow. Ivan leaves home. Okay, so now we're going to get into the real meat of the story. So there's this sign, which is kind of a warning to Ivan. And it says that, if you go in this direction, your horse will be killed. But if you go in this direction, you'll be killed. So Ivan goes with the one where the horse is going to be killed. And it's tempting to treat this as like some sort of interdiction. I don't know if I would be able to say that it is, because the interdiction is usually violated. It seems a little weird. Ivan actually uses the information that he gets here to help himself out and to be successful. So it's hard to say what function exactly this sign serves. I'm trying to think if there's any that could work for it. You could call it, you could maybe call the sign a donor, but and maybe you could say that there's testing in terms of the sign causing him to figure out what he wants, but it's pretty loose. But I'll put it down here anyway, that maybe there is a donor sequence with the sign. But I think where we get into the real donor sequence is with our good friend, the wolf. And it's fun to have the wolf be such a helper in this story. And the test is, of course, the wolf eats the horse, which, of course, Prince Ivan knew would happen because of the sign. And the wolf says, "Why have you come?" Well, it's because the alternative is dying. But the wolf actually takes pity on Ivan and becomes the companion. So the gift of the wolf's companionship and help throughout his journey. So this is the story of, the wolf going through and helping Ivan solve his problems. So he's off on his journey to try and solve his problem. And the wolf is helping him every step along the way. So let's check out some of the things that the wolf does to help him out. The wolf transports him to the castle of the first Tsar, which is Tsar Afron. And transportation is props letter G. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's something a donor or a helper can do. And now we get into a situation where Ivan actually fails a commandment. So I think this is an example of that interdiction and the violation of the interdiction here in the first castle. It's a little bit Mario, isn't it, with all these different castles here? But the interdiction here is don't touch the Firebird's cage. But of course, it's violated. Ivan touches the cage. And that causes some problems. Tsar Afron finds him, gets mad at him, and sets Ivan off on a quest. Now, because this isn't Ivan's original problem, you could say that it might be tempting to say that this is a harm or a lack or something like that. But I think the best way to go about this is to say that it is a difficult task that Ivan must solve, which is get the horse from the next castle. And so Ivan goes off to get the horse from the next castle. And we could kind of say that Tsar Afron is a dispatcher. So I guess there's two different ways to do this. We could do it as something that's like the problem to another problem. We could kind of start the story over again. And in that case, we would treat Afron as more of a dispatcher character. Or we could just do it as a difficult task and go from A to M. So prop does say you can super glue, well, it doesn't use that word, but you can super glue different moves together. You can connect A to G, and then you have another A. You could do something like that if you want to. I feel like he'd save it for where there's parataxis, when two fairy tales have kind of been smushed together. But it does seem like that's an interpretation we could go with as well. Okay, so now Ivan's got a difficult task again, and now he's being given another interdiction, which is don't touch the bridle of the horse. And of course he touches the bridle of the horse. So we're back to gamma and delta again. And we're back to getting difficult tasks again. And we get this one from a new czar who is named, what was it? Kuzmin. And so we could consider it that dispatcher situation over again, in which case we might go to A to A to A, although really they'd be lowercase a's, I think, because we're talking more about a problem, but not I don't know. I don't know if I interpret these czars as villains, so I don't think it would be a harm. But we're doing some repetition here. I like using difficult task for this, but as you can see, it's open to interpretation. So now he has a new difficult task, which is to get the Princess Helen. And I should mention that the wolf is transporting him all along the way. Oops. So the wolf transports him to the next castle, which is the castle of Kuzmin, and then he transports him to yet a third castle, 4 if you count his father's, which is Tsar Dalmat. Okay. So now the wolf helps the prince out because now the prince wants to marry the princess, wants to marry the beautiful Helen, who might have some connection to Helen from Greek mythology. I don't know, it's possible. But she is said to be the most beautiful woman right here. So that's why I find that so interesting. So now basically the prince wants to keep Helen, but and the horse and the Firebird. And he still hasn't solved his original problem of getting the Firebird, but he's kind of on his way to the wedding because the princess has appeared. But he still hasn't done his solving the original problem yet. Okay, so the wolf has help. The wolf gives him help. And what do we want to call this help? The wolf transforms himself into Princess Helen. I'd call this N, solution to the difficult task. Wolf, I don't know if we know if the wolf is a guy. Sometimes the wolf is described as it. The wolf transforms into Helen so as to allow Ivan to seemingly give Helen to Kuzmin, but keep her for himself. So there we go. Okay, we finally solved a problem after all this time. There's been a lot of sort of deferring of that. And so Kuzmin is defeated. He's out of the story. We've taken care of his task. Okay, now the wolf transports him back to Kuzmin. So there's a lot of G in this story if you really want to examine all the examples. And then the wolf takes him back to the castle of Afron with the horse. So we're going back to the castle of Afron. And again, the wolf transforms into horse. Into the horse. And this sort of repetition where the wolf is doing the same things over and over again, and Ivan's doing the same things over and over again, makes a lot of sense. These are rules that help us remember things in the story. They sort of make the story seem like it has a pattern, like it has a flow. And we love the rule of 3. So, of course, there's 3 czars who Ivan meets along the way. And this allows Ivan to get the Firebird. So we finally have K. He gets the Firebird. I saw some of you argue, and I thought this was very interesting, that he didn't get he doesn't achieve K until he gets back home. And you might be right. But yeah, I think you could go either way with this, depending on how you want to defer, how long you want to defer him solving his original problem. But I like to think that when he gets the Firebird, that's him solving the original problem because he finally has the culprit of the cherry theft and he has done what his father wanted. So now he just has to bring the Firebird home. So that's going to be tricky. All right, so at this point we break the pattern here of the going through all these castles and whatnot. The prince falls asleep, has a rest, and his brothers come by, and his brothers kill him and try and take all his stuff, the horse, the Firebird, and even a beautiful girl, the text says. So they plotted to kill their brother and take everything for themselves. So this is probably the best function to put this with is pursued by the villain. I think that's the closest example. But you could arguably treat this as a struggle with the villain instead. A conflict with the villain that is inconclusive. I think that works too. The reason why I'm going for pursuit here as the example of the trope is because pursuit is very often connected with rescues. You're running from the villain, you're trying to get somewhere, that's what Ivan's doing. So I lean towards that one. And we have our moment of rescue, which is the wolf brings him back to life using a bird and some water, using a kind of clever trick there. We could do this in a few different orders here, but let's put the pursuit and the rescuing together, and then also mention that the brothers are being classic false heroes, making false claims. Now we could put this up here too in the interdiction phase back in the preparatory part because the brothers fail. That'd be an option, but I'm going to leave it out just to focus on having it here. They're claiming they did it, and taking the stuff from Ivan. And it's interesting how often we see the sort of brothers against brothers, brother trying to take the brother's stuff for himself kind of story. We see that in the Bible too with Jacob and Esau. It's interesting that is a storyline that appears across cultures, and I wonder what connection that has to Prop's idea of the false hero here. But the wolf manages to bring Ivan back to life, so that's good. And now they chase the elder two brothers, and I think this is maybe a good time for a struggle with the villain. There is a conflict with the villain, but you also want to mention punishment. So I could see it either way. Struggle with the villain, and I think we'd also want to add victory over the villains because he does defeat them. So this is like one action that could fit into all these categories at once: struggle with the villains, victory over the villains, and punishment of the villains. Or you could leave H and I out and just say it's a punishment because the brothers get torn apart by a wolf. Hooray! They deserved it because they killed their brother. So it does seem kind of fair, doesn't it? All right. And so Ivan finally gets home, and as you guys mentioned, this is a moment of exposing the villains. They are revealed because Ivan tells his father. It's amazing that he actually believes him. Yeah, my brothers tried to kill me, but this wolf got him. But this is a world where Firebirds exist, so maybe that all works out. Maybe they can believe him. But the Tsar mourned the loss of his two sons, but he was soon comforted by the wedding. This is a classic Propian wedding, happily ever after because you married the princess. But I should also mention, oh gosh darn, what was it I was going to mention? Oh yes, recognition. The recognition is when the hero is recognized. quite frequently when he returns to his home. So I don't think we have an example of Q because Ivan doesn't really spend any time unrecognized. So I'm going to just skip straight to O. He is recognized as the one who did all these things, even though he's kind of not. It was the villain, not the villain. Sorry, it was the wolf who did all these things. But you know, Ivan's getting recognized as the one who deserves to have all this stuff, and his father's loyal son who did all these heroic things, in theory. So Ivan is recognized, and so that's kind of part of this story too. He isn't really recognized because of a brand, but you don't always have to have a brand or a mark or anything like that to be recognized. And I should mention, we'll again use our little V as a down arrow here. That Ivan returns home, down arrow, then he exposes his brothers and is recognized. And you know what? I like this order better. Recognize and then exposure of the villains. So according to Prop, this is a story of the structure alpha, beta, gamma, delta, A, B, C, up arrow, D, E, F, D, E, F, G, gamma, delta, M, G, gamma, delta, M, G, G, N, G, N, K, P, R, R, S, L, H, I, U, down arrow, O, E, X, W. Or at least that's what Prop would say. And this is the thing about Prop, is that he would say that, you know, once you know what these structures are, you've identified the story. You've given it like this core identity that is, you know, how you would recognize the story, pick it up out of a lineup of 100 other fairy tales, is the exact structures that are present within it. But you know, as we've seen, as I've been discussing here, and as you guys have seen already, is that there's a lot of different directions you can go with this. Like, do you call the wolf a donor or a hero? Do you say this happen? Do you say the false hero happens here, or does it happen here? Do you want to say that there is a struggle and a victory over the villains, or do you just want to go straight to the punishment? There's a lot of ambiguity there. So you don't absolutely have like something that is so like scientifically calculating as Prop wanted it to be. There's still a lot of room for interpretation and decision. So that's one, I don't know if you'd call it a flaw, but that's one thing about his method of analysis. It might be a flaw for people who want to have like an absolute like precise framework for analyzing these stories. The other thing is that it leaves a lot out. Now, in a story that's relatively simple like this one, you know, you don't have as much left out as, say, The Wizard of Oz, where The Wizard of Oz has themes about home and stuff like that. But this story kind of has stuff going on. You know, it has brothers versus brothers. You know, Prop can't really talk about like the idea of conflict between brothers in any effective way. He just, you know, knows that they're the villains. And Firebirds and wolves, you know, these are things that make this story unique. But for Prop, it doesn't really matter whether it was the wolf or like a witch or like a dude with a machine gun or a pirate who helped him out along the way. I mean, all of those would be fun stories to read, I'm sure. But I just find it interesting that Prop can't really talk about specifics like that. He can only talk in terms of structures using this methodology anyway. I also think some of his categories are definitely up for debate. I think he's definitely identified some of the most core themes and tropes of fairy tales, but you know, there's a lot of wiggle room there too. And I could see people making some other arguments like, you know, maybe we should roll donors and helpers into the same category or something like that. There's a lot of different directions you could go with this. But, you know, at the same time, I think it's helpful in a lot of ways to, you know, be looking at these structures. And maybe if you start with the structures, and then after you sort of are identifying what are the things that this story is doing, then you can move on to talking more specifically about how this story is more unique than that. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think. This is part of kind of the question that we're looking at here for our discussion question today. And the discussion question I want to leave you guys with is, do you think that Prop's methodology could be usefully applied to myths? I mean, we talked a little bit about that already, I think, but, you know, should this methodology be applied to myths? Should it be applied to stories in general? And if we did, how would we go about that? I definitely want to know what you guys think and just sort of your thoughts on props usefulness overall. Next time on Tuesday, we'll be looking at someone who very much has a methodology that's much more focused on ideas and values. So he can talk more about the content. Now he talks about it in a sort of weird, confusing way, and he does still spend a lot of time on structure, but we'll get into that. We'll dig into it as weird and confusing as it is, and we'll see if we can maybe make the next step from just talking about structure to talking about what are the important ideas in the story. All right. I'll see you guys in the discussion question, and I will upload my little list here. And I thought all your guys' were great, so great job on that. All right, catch you later.